Hello and welcome to the first introduction session of the TRENTOS SDK. My name is Matthias Buhl. I'm a software developer here at HENSOLDT Cyber, and in this session we will take a closer look how the SDK can be unpacked, installed, and what it is comprised of. First, we will unpack the SDK and take a closer look at its contents. So as we can see, the TRENTOS package contains an SDK archive and a README. Let's open the README to get some input regarding the next steps. As we can see, we need to copy the archive to the development machine and unpack it using the command that's provided in the file. Make sure to copy this terminal command because you will need that later. This process might take some time, so please be patient here. Alright, so now that the archive has been successfully copied to the development machine, it's time to unpack it. And for that, just open the terminal in this current folder and run the command that we previously copied from the README file. The archive has been successfully unpacked, and we can take a closer look at its contents. As you can see, the package contains a document that offers a step-by-step guide of how to get started with the TRENTOS SDK, which we'll cover in more detail in a separate session. Other than the documentation, you can see the root folder of the SDK and a folder containing the Docker build and test images. We'll show you how to set up the TRENTOS Docker environment separately. So, let's get started with the SDK root folder. Along the various folders we can see, containing the resource binaries and documentation of the SDK library, the root folder also contains a master build script to run the build system. This script supports out-of-source builds for any arbitrary system you might be working on. And you will come across this script once you start building a TRENTOS system. But let's start by going through the different folders, starting with the bin folder. The bin folder contains pre-built binaries of Linux command line tools. And these tools are intended to ease the development workflow, and you will get in contact with them when you try out the demos given with the SDK. And that should give you a better understanding when and how these tools can be handy in the development process. The sources for these pre-compiled tools can be found in the tools folder. As mentioned before, the SDK contains a set of demos that are provided to give you a better understanding of how a TRENTOS system can be assembled. And we provide a range of demos here, from the classic Hello World demo, it's very simple, and then adding complexity with the TLS demo that showcases how a secure connection can be established to a remote server. And finally, the IoT demo that showcases a rather typical IoT use case broken down into several separated components. And speaking of components, the components folder of the SDK is one that you should really familiarize yourself with before you start creating any larger TRENTOS systems. What we can see here is a collection of reusable CAmkES components which can be easily integrated into any new TRENTOS system you might be assembling. And this can greatly accelerate the creation of any new system you might be working on, as many key infrastructure components can be quickly integrated and connected, allowing you to focus on implementing the application itself rather than having to spend too much time setting up the infrastructure surrounding it. The core API folder contains the APIs for all the available subsystems. So in here, you will find all the relevant API header files you might eventually include in the projects you are working on. And in addition to that, the CAmkES folder contains all the generic CAmkES component interfaces that are implemented by the provided SDK libraries. And as the name already suggests, the libs folder contains all the libraries and core system sources. And so many of the libraries that we can see here implement the OS Core API that we previously looked into and already serve as the backend to the offered reusable CAmkES components. But apart from that, these libraries can of course also be integrated into any new developed component in whatever way your specific use case or system architecture requires. The resources folder contains all the necessary firmware and bootloader files required to run a TRENTOS system on one of the supported platforms. So for each of these platforms, you will find a dedicated folder here containing all the required and mentioned resources. In addition to that, you will also find a folder containing ready-to-use OpenOCD configuration files that, along with the documentation provided in the SDK, will help you to get started with OpenOCD hardware debugging. The script folder contains several utility scripts that are intended to ease the development workflow, as they can take care of a lot of repetitive processes, such as opening the Docker build and test environments. As you probably know, the SDK is based on the SEL4 microkernel, and on top of that, the CAmkES framework. Therefore, the SDK SEL4 CAmkES folder contains all the resources necessary to create the underlying layers of every TRENTOS system. The details for all the points we just discussed can be found in the doc folder, which contains all the relevant SDK documentation. This is a highly recommended starting point when you want to get familiar with all the contents of the development kit. In here, you will find documents on how to get started, the release notes, and most importantly, the TRENTOS handbook. So as you can see, the handbook contains detailed information on how to set up the TRENTOS Docker environment, which will also be covered in more detail in the next session. An introduction to the underlying SEL4 microkernel and CAmkES framework, as well as a detailed description of the reusable system components and all the libraries, demos, and tools provided by the SDK. That is all for this session. I hope you enjoyed it. In the next session, I will show you how to set up the Docker build and test environment and how to build a TRENTOS system.